I bet it's just killing you seeing the soft glow just inches away.
This for y'all.
Someone wants
This for my
to tell you
police
something
officers.
or ask you something.
Texting the
come
driver.
on,
PSA.
answer it already.
Huh? Yeah, she did, yeah.
Just so we're clear, that wasn't my fault. Next time, ignore your inner voice. Don't text and drive.
Stay up on what's happening here at Power. We've got new shows, new guests, and
You ready?
new events that help us
You
connect with the
know
community.
it.
Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Power 108.9. You can also go to power1089.com to get all of the updated news and happenings here at Power. Thanks for listening.
Keep me on track. Hola, hola, hola. You are listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. Today we have two officers here, and I also have a special guest, Cordell, and we are going to be talking about sex and human trafficking, which is a hot topic and seems to be pretty big in Atlanta, in Georgia. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming out, taking the time to do this radio appearance and to help me on this journey. Then we have Cordell here. So first, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Officer Melton. I work with Cobb County Police Department. Right now I'm in our public information office, but I spent 3 years in special victims.
Okay.
And I'm Sergeant Wayne Delk. I am the Sergeant of the Public Information Office.
Okay. And you are, sir?
I'm Cordell Roll. I'm an attorney. And here in Georgia, practicing law.
Okay. Well, thank you all once again. So today I want to talk about sex and human trafficking. And the reason why I want to talk about that, because I'm kind of new to Georgia. I've been down here back down here about 8 months. And I'm seeing that this is such a large business in a sense. And it's such a worldwide crime. And I don't know why it's become near and dear to me. But the purpose of me having you all on here was to truly provide one is how to possibly identify someone that may be a victim of sex and human trafficking, and two, to provide safety tips to stop someone who could possibly become a victim of human sex trafficking. So I did prepare some questions. I know it was a lot.
All right.
So first, can you tell us what sex and human trafficking is?
Sure. So really what it is when somebody does something to recruit or harbor or transport or advertise even a minor child. And the purpose of that is for sexual activity, commercial sexual activity. And there's going to be some type of exchange for value. So it might be money, drugs, a place to stay. All of that is for sexual activity.
Okay. And how big would you say that is, sex and human trafficking in Georgia? And so when I looked it up, even though it's not, it appeared to kind of be the same thing in a sense. You know, you have human trafficking, which people are traded for labor, and then you have sex trafficking, which people are traded for sex. But even in a human trafficking aspect, it appeared to me as people were still traded for sex as well. So why do they call it sex or human trafficking?
So there's a lot of different terms that are used for it, but typically it means the same thing, that these people are being sold, whether it be for a service or that be a sexual service. It's people that are someone else is profiting off of acts that these people have to do.
Correct. Okay. And how big would you say that was in Georgia?
So Atlanta is considered a hub for sex trafficking, specifically child sex trafficking. And the FBI actually considers it one of the top 14 cities in the United States.
Wow. Because I think I read somewhere at one point it said Georgia was number one, but it's not number one city.
I don't know if they're number one, but they're one of the top. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a busy area. You've got the busiest airport. There's a lot of strip clubs near motels. There's the adult entertainment industry. So there's a lot of things that really bring that towards this area.
And you also have the fact that Atlanta is an international city, so you have a lot of people coming in and out of the city from all over the world.
Okay. And so my next question is, what does a John or a Jane Doe look like? Someone who is sex trafficking? Because I guess when I think of someone who is sex trafficking, they don't look like the obvious to me. And I wouldn't know what to look for.
So the actual trafficker, they don't have a standard look.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think back to, the 90s movies and the music videos where they see somebody wearing the fur coats and the top hats and
like
chains.
a pimp.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily what they look like. Typically, they could look like just an everyday person. There's not a standard uniform for a trafficker.
So there is no stereotype that
No.
one should go by.
They could be male or female. They could be any race. There's not a standard.
And what would you say the ratios are for John? And I'm just using these hypothetical, these made up, Johns for men and Janes for women. Ratios are as far as men and women who sex traffic children, in a sense. So is it more, I believe, and based off of what I read, that, more men are sex trafficking, young women. But I also know that there are women in the industry as well.
There are, and sometimes women can be used in a different aspect because they can be used more in the recruitment because they play that big sister role to these, especially the juvenile females. And so that's a way for them to really, bring these girls in. I say girls, boys are victims also, but we see more girls. So sometimes you have a male and a female that work as a team as traffickers.
And okay, we are about y'all know I'm here with Mike, y'all know we do this every week. We are about to take a break, but when we come back, we are going to continue this conversation on sex and human trafficking with Officer Melton and Sergeant Delk. You are listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. Y'all, he tortures me every time I'm here. Like, I'm telling you.
When you hear the music, just you don't have to jump out as soon as you hear it. But when the music come on, just begin to wrap it up. That's all.
What you have? Oh, I forgot to put that hotline.
See, now I have it.
Oh, I have it. Did I send too many questions? I'm like, they're gonna kill me.
No, you said too
You got an hour.
I said, 'cause I don't think we can get all this in 1 hour.
I didn't want to not have enough, but then I also figured that I let the conversation take its course.
Yeah.
And my main goal is to pretty provide safety tips and like what are the hot areas, because this is just children just on my heart and how to protect them in a sense.
So I worked special victims for 3 years, and I specifically did children's crimes. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, like I know. I was just having a.
I want you to do that over here. Look.
Y'all see, I can't have a conversation, yo. I can't look at my phone when I'm here. I can't breathe.
It's Power 108.9, Charlotte. If I was Reggie Rouse at V103, guess what? You'd be in the office.
They be ratchet.
Exactly. That's Reggie. So,
What?
you ready?
Yeah. Oh. Gotta do this.
Welcome back to this portion of the show.
Welcome back to this portion of the show.
Got you, shawty. Can somebody call in? Welcome back. You are listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. This portion of the show was brought to you by westafrica.com. That's WESTFRICA.com. They are located at 415 West Court Street, Cincinnati, Ohio 45203. You can also contact them at 513-684-9111. We are going to continue our conversation with Officer Melton and Sergeant Delk and my special guest Cordell on sex and human trafficking. So right before the break, we were talking about what's the ratios of John and Jane Does in reference to soliciting children. So my next question is, what kind of cases are you seeing?
So in Cobb, a lot of the cases that we have had they're runaway juveniles, and they have been somehow attracted to their pimp, their trafficker, and a lot of times their acts are out of motels and hotels in the area. They're only there for a couple nights, and they tend to move to another one. Sometimes it's in state, other times they travel out of state.
So the sex traffickers, would you say that they pretty much solicit the hotels looking for juveniles or looking for people who can... No?
Not the hotels.
Motels.
They typically find the juveniles through other means. It might be social media. That's a big one right now, using the internet and social media, and different apps and chat rooms. But they actually traffic them out of the hotel. So once they have them and they start traveling with them, they've built that relationship, then they rent out hotel rooms, and that's where they have their customers come to.
So can you walk me through the steps and walk the listeners through the steps? So hypothetically speaking, I'm a runaway juvenile. I run away. I don't know where to go. So how do I become at risk? I know I'm at risk the moment I decide to run away from, my safe haven. So what does that process look like? So I'm running away, don't know where I'm going. How would you say, and I'm just trying to do this for the listeners, that I become more of a what's the word I'm looking for, Cordell?
You're vulnerable, or you're exposed to the environment for sex trafficking.
Right. Like how do I get into that space? So you said that the traffickers don't really solicit hotels in reference to the juveniles. So how do they end up there?
So vulnerable is a key word. That's what they're going to prey on, is the vulnerability. And a lot of these victims have a history that has led them to run away. It's not just a kid that got mad at mom and dad over some chores they had to do. A lot of these kids have a history of sexual abuse. They've lived through neglect at home. They've got parents that have a criminal record, and that's affected the child, or maybe their parents have drug issues. So there's a lot of things. One of the biggest ones is the bulk of these victims have been sexually abused in the past. So they look out, they go out, they're looking for someone that they can find that protection and trust in. Mm-hmm. And once they're preyed on, that vulnerability, it could be as simple as, hey, let me go get you something to eat. Hey, let me take care of you. I'll get your nails done. Let me get your hair done. Look, you can trust me. And they build a relationship, and once that trust is there, it turns into, hey, I need you to do something for me.
So of course, on average, what would you say it takes for them to build a relationship? So what's the time frame?
It can be different for all of them. I've had some experience with cases where the juvenile was only gone from home for maybe 24 hours.
Wow.
And somebody's already found them.
Wow. Okay. And how young are you seeing these victims?
So the average age, according to a 2011 study by the U.S. Department of Justice, said that the average age was between 12 and 14. Oof. But there have been younger kiddos, unfortunately.
And so I know this is not one of the questions, but these young men and women become these victims. Do they parents, because they are victims of sexual abuse, do their parents ever trying to find them, or do they just be like, oh, this is just another case that they ran away, they'll come back, or after X amount of days or time, then we'll put out a call that they're missing?
The majority of these kids they're repeat runaways. So sometimes the parents may not act as quickly, but a lot of these we find have been reported as runaways. Some of them have become considered like a ward of the state. They're in state custody because they've had so many issues with runaway, and there's so many issues at home. So they may have left a group home or somewhere like that. But typically we find that they have been reported missing.
Without giving away what I would call trade secrets, because I know you guys do a lot of stuff undercover and things like that, just in a general sense to the public, how how's it exposed that there's some sex trafficking going on? For example, if I'm a flight attendant, I'm sure that they have key questions. There's a lot of verification that goes on, things not matching. But if, like you guys mentioned at the hotel or maybe at a gas station, what is the average citizen looking for to say, something isn't right?
Well, sometimes it's just that gut feeling. If you look and you see a younger, maybe, and I use female when I say this a lot just because the bulk of our victims are female. Of course, there's males as well, but sometimes you'll see a teen that's got a significantly older boyfriend or companion that's with them. They might have bruises and cuts and injuries that just doesn't seem right. If they're traveling with an older non-family member, a person that's not their guardian, they may have branding by special tattoos, so their trafficker may have branded them.
If I'm just the person in a gas station or something like that, I use that term from the movies. Everything happens in the gas station. What are some of the questions that I may ask a young person? And I say young person meaning, let's just say 13 on up, somebody that can respond, or some signals to give them to say, is it okay? That something that you can inquire without tipping off maybe some type of pimp or trafficker or something like that. What are some of those things?
So it's difficult because a lot of these victims, they want to protect their trafficker because that person has become their protector and their provider. So it's not always as easy as saying, hey, are you okay? Or are you, being trafficked?
It's not like a kidnapping.
Right. But, you can always ask if they're okay. You might not get the answer that, you're expecting, but I think the gut feeling, if something doesn't seem right to you, there's no harm in calling police.
And I was just going to reiterate and say, even if you get the response you're not expecting and they say, no, I'm fine, you can still call the police.
Okay.
If it just doesn't seem right, if it's not sitting well with you, you can call the police. You can get that tag number on the car if there's a car. You can get some identifiers for us to follow up on.
Yeah, because that was going to be my next question. At what point does the police have the ability to step in and check on somebody versus just, I'm not feeling right, versus, I think, we need to pull this car over type of thing.
Right. So if it's described to us, if it's really articulated to us by the concerned caller, and we, that's a reasonable concern, we can always stop and try to investigate. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily get information.
Right.
But for us, there's certain things that we're trained on, and there are some excellent training out there for law enforcement on different things to spot, different things to look for when you're doing even a roadside interview with a potential trafficker and victim. So there's different things that you can look for. Unfortunately, sometimes you can't.
Right.
So how do you help the helpless in a sense? So it sounds like some of these people are protecting a sex trafficker, and not all of them want a way out.
The majority of them will protect their trafficker. Interviews with these victims are very difficult sometimes because they're going to do everything they can to protect them. And it might be out of fear and intimidation. They could have been beaten. They could have been raped. There's a lot of things that, could have happened to them that make them really want to protect that person.
The dynamics of that relationship are really difficult for us to actually get in there and get them out a lot of times because they have a bond with that person who was keeping them.
That's interesting because one of the dynamics I would think if I'm a child in that situation is, am I going to get in trouble?
Right.
For this, this bad act that I know is probably bad, but I don't really know the consequences.
And there is a lot of self-blame when victims in these cases because they think, well, I agreed to it.
Right.
But legally, they're under 16. They can't consent to sex, and they're under 18, so they can't be entered into that contractual, sexual agreement. So they're not at fault. They're looked at as victims, and that's another thing in looking at sex trafficking is that shift over from them being suspects themselves into they're actually victims. And once they are out of this life, they're considered survivors.
Mm-hmm.
So how long would you say the average person, how long would you say the average child, young adult, is a victim before they actually want out? and they fully understand that this person is truly not protecting me, but they're violating me?
It varies. Some will tell you that they've been with their trafficker for a long time, and that long time is a week or a month. And others will say that they've been with them for 6 months. They've been with multiple traffickers. So it varies for each one. And a lot of times there's something that happens that becomes that final, okay, I want out of this. And for some, it's recovery. So if that's law enforcement finding them, getting them away from that life, getting them into some of the rehabilitative services that are offered here in Georgia for victims like that, getting them away from that, and that can sometimes be their turnaround.
And do you see when people come out of it that they go back in it?
Sometimes.
Voluntarily or involuntarily?
So I wouldn't say any actually go in voluntarily, because there's something there that they're looking for, whether it be that protection or it's a survival mechanism for food and shelter. So some of them will go back, and it's that survival need.
That brings up another point, which is what happens after their John is arrested, because now you have this runaway individual under 18 who essentially is probably not wanting to be in foster care at the same time, even if they do want to be rescued. So what do you kind of see that balance act in the grand scheme of things?
So for some, they're returned back to their families because that is their custodian, and that's where they go back. Others that are in state custody may be returned to a group home. But there are services here in Georgia that we're able to get them to that provide those rehabilitative services, the counseling that they need, the therapy to try to rehabilitate them back into a normal teenager life and get them back into school.
Is it possible for a individual to get involved in those services without having, let's just say, being rescued? Let's just say a individual is a victim now and want to escape. Like, how do they get involved in the actual services besides calling the police? Maybe they just want to leave, but have a safe haven. Can they just go to one of these facilities, and what are they? What are some of the facilities?
So the ones that I was most familiar with, they were referred by victim services. So I'm not sure if they can go there. I'm sure if they reached out, though, and said, hey, I need help, I need to get away from this, they're going to get them in the right direction. They're going to get them help, because that is the goal of these places.
And victim services is part of the police office?
So that's a service that's offered through our district attorney's office.
Okay.
And in Cobb, it's a really cool setup because we have a children's advocacy center that is paired with our Crimes Against Children, which is Safe Path Children's Advocacy Center. And it's a collaborative effort between DFACS, between Safe Path, between the police department, the district attorney's office, as well as sometimes we're able to get services in from the FBI, because they have a match task force which is specific to the sex trafficking cases, so they're able to direct as well.
And if they're runaways, let's just say in the system, they won't get in trouble if they come in through the victim's services.
I can't speak for what the court does on that, but the most important thing is that we get them away from their trafficker, because their trafficker's an abuser.
Okay.
And so how do you all deal with the parents? I'm just curious. So are the parents ever held accountable? So you have a child that's a runaway, and the reason for them runaway is because they were experiencing sexual abuse. You call DFACS, do DFACS step in? How is that situation handled? So if that child wants to go back home, that they're going back home to a safe and secure environment.
So that would be something we'd have to find out from the child. And you'd ask questions in your interview, and they're considered forensic interviews when you're talking to children, and you're asking questions to find out why they left home, and hopefully they disclose that information to you and you're able to ensure their safety. If not, DFACS is typically going to remain involved for a little bit to help with the family, help provide services that they can.
So if a child becomes a victim of sex trafficking, DFACS automatically steps in?
We typically work these cases together, so we would ask for their assistance in that. If it's a child from out of state, we're going to need DFACS' assistant in working with the out-of-state, their child protective services, so we can make sure that reunification with the family happens. Or if they are in DFAC's custody, then we're working with DFACs to find placement for them. So there's a lot of different roles that DFACs can play in these.
The Children's Advocacy Center plays a huge role in that. That's why you have so many different agencies working together. Safe Path, the CAC that we're affiliated with and we work with, they do a lot of work to make sure the children get a lot of services. So they work hand in hand with DFACs. DFACs can provide services through the state, but Safe Path actually has their own counselors on hand. So even when the state services run out, they still have additional resources available to them.
Okay. You are listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. When we come back, we are going to finish this conversation with Officer Melton and Sergeant Delk and a special guest, Cordell, on sex and human trafficking.
That's Marietta.
That's Marietta.
It's my road, though.
Is this Safe Path?
I was going to ask overall. That's one of my questions over here. It seems like, I know we have to go back there, but it seems like just listening to you all talk, like there is no true way to identify somebody, and that's what I wanted to get to, right?
I mean, it's difficult.
It's extreme.
And these girls, they don't look 13 or 14, so it's, I mean, their hair's done, makeup's done, they look a lot older than they actually are sometimes, so that's difficult.
And really big sport they don't stick out. You can't spot them because of the digital age and social media. All these different apps. It's easy to get an
Yeah. Backpage was a big one though. I mean, you could scroll through there and looking at some of the titles, how they're written, you're like, so it was kind of like Craigslist, but it was specific to sex.
Never heard of that.
Craigslist for sex. You got a big old booty picture on there, advertising the massage.
That's how the picture looks.
Yeah, they advertise the massage. He's like, wait a minute.
You ready, Christeria Lynn?
Born that way. Welcome back. You are listening to Christeria Lynn. Let's Talk on Power 108.9. We are talking about sex and human trafficking. This portion of the show was brought to you by westafrica.com at 415 West Court Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45203. He can be contacted at 513-684-9111. Today I have Officer Melton and Sergeant Delk of the Cobb County Police Department, and I have Cordell, a special guest, and we are going to continue our conversation. So right before we went on break, we were talking about identifying some of the victims that could possibly be identifying someone that could possibly be a victim of sex trafficking. But one of the questions that I have is that what happens to the Jane or John Doe once they're arrested?
So, depending upon what they are charged with, it could vary. It could be a pimping charge, or it could go up to a human trafficking charge, as well as any other that may be charged as well. They're taken to jail, dependent upon their charges, dependent upon their criminal history. They may or may not be given a bond. And after that, it's the waiting game for court.
What's the sentence that someone convicted may possibly carry? And I know it may depend on if they have any previous, convictions or charges or anything like that. But for someone who doesn't, what would they possibly be looking at?
So for human trafficking, it's a felony, and I believe it's between 10 to 20 years that it's punishable by. But if they're able to prove any coercion or deception to the trafficking, I believe they can extend that to 25 to 50 year.
Do you find these cases are hard to prove? Not necessarily because they not hard to prove, not necessarily because they didn't do it, but because the victims failed to speak up, or the victims, they failed to come to court. So where does that leave that sex trafficker?
So the victims, again, they're going to be protective of that person. They're going to be reluctant to testify against them, and it could be that intimidation or fear. But they sometimes don't trust law enforcement, and they see the court as an extension of law enforcement, and so that's another reason that they may be hesitant to participate in the actual court process. Sometimes they're difficult to prove because there's a lack of witnesses. Sometimes you don't have all of the physical evidence that you would want. So there's different aspects to it that could make it difficult.
There are tons of variables that go into that, and you touched on one of them. The victim could have so many different things in the back of their minds with regard to the legal system. They don't want to testify, and it's not, it's a distrust of the law enforcement, distrust of the system completely, and that could have been built up because of their prior cases or their prior history with law enforcement, and them feeling that they weren't treated fairly, that their prior abuser wasn't sentenced harshly enough, or they weren't taken out of that abusive home that they were in. So there's so many different variables that go into place there.
So that person is essentially put back on the streets to do the same thing?
Not necessarily. Sometimes they'll use our victim advocates to try to talk to that victim and, encourage them to be there to support them, and hopefully they will be able to be there to testify.
But the sex trafficker, if the victim never comes forward and then you have little to no proof that or no one is speaking up, shall I say, then that sex trafficker goes back to doing what they were doing.
It's possible. It's more on the court's end than our end.
How often do you see that? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, that's hard to say. Yeah, we don't know, but I mean, obviously it happens, but we don't know how often that happens.
So tell us a little bit more about your experience, your overall experience. And I know you said you did child advocacy for 3 years.
I worked as a detective in our crimes against children for 3 years. So I did investigations of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. And we also had several sex trafficking cases that I was able to work or assist with during my time there.
Okay.
I did it for 2 years, but it was over a decade ago. That unit has grown and has changed quite a bit. I think we're a lot more aggressive now as far as going after the sex traffickers. We're not just responding to the cases that are brought before us. We're actually actively out assisting with other agencies. We're actually part of a task force that actually is out trying to actively go after these guys now.
So you have certain, because I think I seen on the news where they had Operation Endgame in Fulton County, where they recently charged, I think it was like maybe 9, did you see that, 9 or 10 people, it may be up to 60 people with sex trafficking. Mm-hmm. So you do have those operations in Cobb County as well?
We do, and they're typically work jointly through the FBI's Match Task Force, and that's going to be a group of law enforcement throughout the state that work together. It's and that's throughout the United States, the match task force is. And typically law enforcement agencies will have an officer that's assigned to that or is sworn in to be a part of that task force, and that way they can use local law enforcement in conjunction with our federal law enforcement to put more resources towards these operations and try to recover more victims.
So when you're a part of that operation, is there a special training that you have to be placed in that unit?
So a lot of times we have officers in Cobb, I can speak for, in our Crimes Against Children unit that even if they're not assigned to that task force, they attend training for these, for sex trafficking, because it is something that is a potential for you to run into in any kind of sexual abuse case. And especially we would work runaway juvenile cases as well. We'd have involvement with those. And so knowing what to look for is definitely a way to help your investigation and help these victims.
On that note, as the individuals who work these particular crimes, is there any type of therapy that the officers have to go through? You know, because I'm sure you guys see a lot of just craziness in general, and it can be consuming, especially over years. It can be consuming. Is there internal therapy or counseling that you guys just have to deal with every day? And this goes back and piggyback off our question about, you know, training and things like that.
So for a lot of officers, I know that work in that line, because you're also exposed to the child pornography aspect
Right.
as well in some of your cases. A lot of officers find their own coping mechanisms, whether that be working out, finding hobbies outside of work, things like that. And a lot of officers have their own coping mechanisms when actually working the case, whether it be looking at it as this is not real, and that's their way to cope through it. Some officers do eventually have to seek some counseling for that if they struggle with that, and there's nothing wrong with that, because
Right.
you are exposed to a lot.
Yeah, I know as an attorney, there's a high rate of addiction and substance abuse just because of the nature of our business. And when you're talking about, you know, the bar is heavy on just having an entire section on addiction.
We all just really we develop a really
Yeah.
poor sense of humor.
Right.
I mean, we say things we think are funny, and then when we're in mixed company, we say things and people's jaws drop. We're like, no,
Right.
we're not in a law enforcement group. We got a civilian with us. Got to watch our mouths. But you're right. We do develop some different and it doesn't even have to be in that unit. We have officers who've never worked in detective units, but just as a street officer, a road officer, you see so many different things, and they get to see those kids
Right.
too. They respond to those calls. So we do develop some different coping mechanisms. Some of them good, some of them not so good.
Right. And you have to.
And,
Oh, yeah.
I've gone through counseling just to kind of help me get through some
Right.
things in my head. Just, you know, we see things in our line of work that
Right.
normal people don't get to see, and thank goodness they don't get to see them.
And in that unit that I was in, you would think that we were a bunch of kids, because sometimes we all needed breaks. Everybody had Nerf guns.
Right.
You know, you'll find out cops are a bunch of really overgrown kids sometimes. So there would be Nerf gun breaks and different, you know, jokes and things like that around the office. And when you have a really good, strong, cohesive group that works together, sometimes that alone can be the coping mechanism.
Speaking of children, what is the percentage, at least in Georgia, let me deal with narrow the field, of adult versus children human trafficking? More specifically, we spent all this time, the first half hour, talking about children, but what about the adult human trafficking, the sex trafficking? You know, because I'm sure that there's a huge, you know, number. You mentioned strip clubs and things like that, where you would think that they would be 18 or over working, but you know, they're probably working.
I don't know what the percentage would be of it, but I know a lot of people tend to not look at the adult aspect of it as sex trafficking, because they look at those people as, well, they're the criminals too. So they don't think about some of the dynamics that go along with the pimp and the prostitute relationship, for lack of better terms, and so I think some of that gets overlooked sometimes.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. It makes sense because you believe, okay, she's an adult, he's an adult, they can walk away in theory. And so we as the concerned citizen are probably less concerned about that adult, whereas you believe that the child is more vulnerable.
Even though that situation pretty much is the same for that
Right.
adult victim, what we're referring to as a victim now
Right,
in this
right.
case, yeah, it's pretty much the same as for that juvenile as it is for the adult.
Right.
And a lot of times, those adults got started as juveniles.
Right.
So that, but once again, once they become an adult, it's like, well, the law is like, well, you could leave if you wanted to.
Right.
It goes
It's
back
not
to
that
the,
easily.
the survival aspect.
So I want to ask this question. What made you get into this unit, or what made you attracted, in a sense, to the unit of child and sex trafficking?
So the funny thing is, when I started with the police department, I said, I will never work in the crimes against children unit. I couldn't handle it.
Right.
Well, I did 3 years. For me, the biggest thing was children are true victims. They don't have a say in their victimization. They don't choose, and this goes for adults as well, but especially children. They don't choose to be neglected. They don't choose to be physically abused. They don't choose to be sexually abused. And so being able to actually help in the protection of that, it's a very rewarding job.
When I started with the department over 21 years ago, that was the one unit I wanted to work in. I actually left a job as an elementary school teacher, become a police officer, and I wanted to work in crimes against children.
That's interesting.
I lasted all of 2 years.
So to piggyback off of that, and I don't know how much you can or cannot disclose, is there anything that you have seen that made you just be like, you said you lasted 2 years, so I'm pretty sure it was a reason why you lasted 2 years.
That
No,
unit,
actually, I got hijacked, and I was actually the public information officer after that. As an officer, because they said I speak too well, so they put me in front of a camera.
those units have a high burnout rate because of the amount that detectives, officers are exposed to, the number of cases, the number of hours you work. So there's times that you don't have officers lasting more than 3 and 4 years in those units just because they're burned out and they need a break. But there's some. I worked for a sergeant who had worked in crimes against children for over 20 years, and she was phenomenal and she loved it. And I do not know how she did it.
Wow, that's awesome.
We had a question on social media. I'm trying to see if I can frame it up right, but it talked about when you guys were talking about earlier how Atlanta is such a hub with the Hartsfield-Jackson, Mercedes-Benz, Phillips Arena. How did you guys in Cobb prepare for this, the Battery? Did you guys have any conversation about now? You got a big venue here in Cobb County that you normally didn't have.
I don't know that there was necessarily specific conversations about it. It's something that, as police officers, you're aware that it's a possibility, and any of our units that are working these areas or extended areas know that it's a possibility. And if they've ran into something that they find suspicious, I know during the time I was at the Crimes Against Children unit, we had several officers that would call us and say, hey, this doesn't seem right to me, and we would go out and investigate.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I actually worked at our academy for a while, so we did a lot of training of our officers just to kind of give them an idea of what to look for, things that are suspicious. And obviously, they aren't trained as well as our crimes against children detectives. So if they saw something that was out of the ordinary, stuck out, they would make that phone call. When we taught them to, and even as a road supervisor, when my guys would come across something, I'd be like, you need to call a detective and see what they think about that.
Okay. Anything else before we go on to...
You can go to the next subject.
Okay, so I know we've talked a lot about identifying victims. What does someone look like? A sex trafficker. How are they handled? But I want to talk about, as we're preparing, for in the last 20 minutes, safety tips. Any safety tips that we can provide? Any safety tips? Any resources? But one thing I forgot to ask: what are the hot areas? Before we go into safety tips, like what are there any areas that you all have identified as hot areas for sex trafficking?
I wouldn't say there's any specific, because it can happen anywhere, but the majority of the places that we see it are going to be in hotels, and that could be county-wide. There's not just a specific area of the county that it is restricted to. It could be any part.
No. Okay, so how does a parent, me, so I have young children, sit a child down? And as I was telling my children, I'm coming on here today and I'm talking about sex and human trafficking, I always tell my 6-year-old, don't walk away, and she always walks away. So how does a parent sit a child down and talk to them and explain to them about sex and human trafficking? Is there anything that I know what me as a parent would say, because to me it's just like the norm, but what are some things that we may not know to say that we should say when we're sitting our children down and trying to protect them?
So one of the resources that I would definitely suggest is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, and their website is phenomenal. They have got several resources. They've actually got a guide on there that's called Child Sex Trafficking in America, a guide for parents and guardians. And it's great because it provides the education about sex trafficking and gives some statistics, as well as some tools and tips on how to start that communication, because not always scare tactics are going to work, and the actual education of the reality of this, I think, could be more effective.
Okay. I know I have a lot of questions, y'all. Are there any apps, anything that parents can do? I know you have the family sharing apps. I have that. I use that for my children. But are there any additional apps that you know about that parents can take an extra step to protect their children?
So, and they're similar to the family sharing apps. There's some parental control apps, and I don't know specific names. You have to get out there and do your research, but there's things that parents can use to monitor what their children are doing on cell phones and social media, just like on a computer. They're able to monitor those social media accounts as well, and just stay aware of what's going on.
How has social media added to or made it more difficult in this trafficking business for you as police officers?
So for us, it makes it difficult, and it also makes it easier, because luckily if we're able to find those accounts, find usernames, we're able to get records from the companies through subpoenas, and so we're actually able to get more evidence sometimes because of that. But it's also difficult because it's streamlined the business. It has made it much quicker, much easier for these traffickers to find their victims and to find their customers, and so sometimes they're able to work quicker. The entire
industry is moving faster.
Absolutely.
On both ends.
Absolutely.
No, that makes sense.
Is there any are there any particular groups? I know there are on social media that children should stay away from? Because I know I'm in a lot of groups. Like, I've just learned to utilize social media in a different way. Before, it's like, oh, let me get on here and post. But now it's like, oh, let me get on here and interact. I'm in single moms groups. I'm in the Red Table Talk with Jada Pinkett. Just all kind of, business groups. Where is there anything that you can add to in reference to social media?
As soon as you name a group for them to be aware of, another one pops up. 2 or 3 more. Those little groups on those different social media sites are constantly being created. So it's difficult for us to say, well, this group you need to stay away from, because they're constantly forming different groups. And that's why it's important for parents to actually monitor what their kids are doing on social media, because these groups are constantly popping up. They're getting on these groups and they're having conversations that they probably shouldn't be having with people they shouldn't be having them with.
Well, and it's also important to educate children about internet safety, social media safety, because you can go on a chat room and you can be anybody, and you can change who you are the next time you log on. So teaching them that, you don't know who's on the other end of that. that chat is really important, and keeping their personal information personal, not sharing names and addresses, phone numbers, and birth dates and things like that.
Yeah, a little 12-year-old Timmy on the other end could be some 47-year-old dude in his basement.
Right.
And that's what kids don't seem to understand. They take people at face value online, and the rest of us know, hey, you don't know who that is on the other end. Have you met them before, or did they go to your school? No, it's some kid that lives somewhere else, a couple towns over. Why are you talking to him? And why are you sharing intimate details? Why does he know where you live? Why does he know your phone number? And that's what we need to educate our children, that they can't trust everyone that they meet online.
Great stuff, great stuff. You're listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. We are about to take a break. When we come back, we are going to continue our conversation with Officer Melton and Sergeant Delk on sex and human trafficking.
You sure that because you the light-skinned spokesperson? I don't know what they saying on social media. Yeah. Light-skinned, bro. That's why they
Get the white and the black crowd.
Yeah.
And then you got female and you got the southern accent, so we got all bases covered.
Based upon just the last comment, it's back to school time.
Okay.
Everybody's putting all the way their children on. This is my child Timothy. He's at such elementary.
Yep.
They
His first day of school.
out there on social
Yep.
media. Well, you have adults who are not social media savvy.
Right.
Well, one of the biggest tricks on social media for sex trafficking is hey, I can get you into a modeling agency. Hey, you want to be a dancer, you want to be an actor? Oh, that's a big one. Big.
Yeah.
Hey, I'll come, let me take some pictures of
We were
you.
trying to avoid back in the day.
Still there.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't even post my children on social media anymore because I saw something where they said, like, when you post your children on social media, it make them more prone to become a victim of whether it's sex trafficking, kidnapping. So people probably think I'm, like, cynical or whatever, but I do not post my children.
There's a video, I think it's Net Smarts, and it's awesome for kids, but it shows you, like, within 5 clicks how much information you can find out about somebody on their social media.
What is it called?
I think it's Net Smarts. I'll look it up before I leave, and I'll give it to you, but
it still kills me today how men are being tricked. Not even being tricked, but how crazy men are to set up a date with a minor. That is sad.
Yes. And the sad thing is, some of them will get away with it. That's why we keep catching.
Because then y'all recently do with that comment that recently did this thing?
It was 2 and 4 the counting. Yeah, they had 2 big ones.
Makes sense. If you have all of these people, you can have 1,000 rabbits in the field.
Yeah, you're gonna catch some. Yeah. It's so amazing. It's still all sick.
What up, y'all? You know it. Welcome back. You are listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. We are talking about sex and human trafficking. I am here with Cobb County Police with Officer Delk. I'm sorry. I don't know why I keep on confusing them with Sergeant Delk and Officer Melton and my special guest, Cordell. We are going to be wrapping up this show, but before we wrap up, we want to give you all some safety tips and some pointers to keep your children and your family safe. So prior to us going on break, we were talking about social media and how children are often lured into sex and human trafficking in social media. So what are some of the safety tips that you can tell us in protecting our children? I know for me, I know people think like, oh, this girl always posting pictures of herself or whatever, but I do not post my children on social. I do here and there. I don't post birthdays. I don't post anything about my children. I really cut back posting on my children altogether on social media.
absolutely. Keeping your personal information and identifying information about your location, your kid's location, keeping that stuff private is one of the biggest safety tips that I could say. Especially teaching kids not to give out this information, because they make a friend on a chat room and they've been friends for 5 minutes on this chat room, and they are ready to tell all their business and all their personal information just like that, because they have quickly built trust in this person they've known for 5 minutes, but they don't even know who's on the other end of that computer.
Mm-hmm. And I know I would like to just add, I have a P.O. box, and my children know, my small children, I have told their teachers, I've told the school, you know, they teach the children their address in case something happens. Although the school has it, you cannot teach my child my address, because my little girl, she is like me, a social butterfly, and she just wants to talk. You know me, like she just wants to talk. So I just give even my older children, they are always supposed to use my P.O. box on everything. So I don't know if that's an option for everyone, but I do know that there's something that we can provide to help mothers and fathers, you know.
Absolutely. And NCMEC is a great resource for not just the sex trafficking.
What is it? The NCMEC?
NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Oh, that's what I have. Okay.
Because they have a lot of safety information as well in preventing abductions and information about that. So it's a great resource for parents. One of the other big things that you can teach younger children is having a password. So
I have one.
Yes.
Yep.
So especially the younger ones that don't necessarily understand yet to differentiate between what adults are supposed to be picking them up or what aren't or who aren't. It's a great way to teach them to identify their trusted adults. So a time that they could use it would be, let's say, if there was an emergency and you were sick and you couldn't pick them up and you sent a close neighbor or someone you knew to pick them up. They could ask them, hey, what's the password? And if they don't know it, that child should be taught and trained to, they immediately go find a teacher at school and tell them, hey, somebody's trying to pick me up, and they're not supposed to.
Yeah, that's good. I do. I don't know where I've seen that, but so all my children have a password, and every 3 months I change.
It's like a computer.
Right, every 3 months I change the password. So is there anything a child or children should not carry? I know a lot of parents want to put their children's name on their backpacks. Don't do that. Is there anything that a child should or should not carry?
Well, like you said about the backpacks, putting that name on the back, anybody can call their name.
Right.
And now they think they know them. So it's good for us to have some kind of way to identify the child. The best way would be for that child to know their phone numbers for their adults, know their address, and know who they're allowed to give that information to. Teaching them who those trusted adults are.
So do you think, do you think it's a bad, I wouldn't necessarily say bad thing, but it may be a challenging thing that I teach my children to use the P.O. box at all times and not use my physical address?
Only if let's say there was an emergency, maybe they couldn't, get a hold of you on the phone, and if there was something going wrong and maybe you were sick and they needed, to tell police, hey, this is where I live, that might be a good time for them to know their actual physical address, or if for some reason they were separated or missing, to know that address. That would be the only time I could think of that.
I was going to say, what happens when they get lost?
That was the only thing I was thinking. If they are lost and they don't know their address, that could be problematic. But if they know the address, they can get home.
Make sure they know mom's phone number.
Right, they know my phone number all day long, but that address, I'm like, okay. So, is there anything that one of my last questions, because we have to wrap up? Is there like a certain word or a certain line that a sex trafficker used to lure a child in?
No. So there's a variety of things that they could say. And again, it's preying on that vulnerability, and they're going to do that however they need to. It could be offering to get them a modeling gig, a dance, audition, a acting audition. So they're going to prey on whatever it is that child's interests are. Maybe it's they just need a boyfriend. They need somebody to trust. They need somebody to confide in. They need food. They need shelter. They need somebody to take care of them. So there's a lot of different ways that they could prey on that vulnerability, but there's not just a key phrase.
Yeah, they're going to be looking for that way in. Whatever that way might be, they're going to look for it, and they're going to try to exploit it. So that's why helping your children build up a good defense helps them out. And also just being aware of what they're doing online, because that's the biggest key right there as a concerned parent. Because most parents are concerned, they just don't think about the fact that computer is a way into their home
Right.
and a way to their children.
Right.
Is there, before we end our show, is there any tips or anything that you want to add that you think is important for anyone to know that we haven't discussed?
I really like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I want to emphasize that again because they are such a great resource.
And they've been around for a while, so I would suggest any parents who actually are looking for any sort of resources to visit their site. They put on great training for us as when I was in the unit. They put on some excellent training for our detectives, and I think for other people who work with children, as far as helping them to not only identify children who may be exploited, but also to provide some sort of care for them after they are recovered.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you both so much for your time today, coming out and talk to us and share with us all the information that you have. Anything else?
No, I was trying to find the website for the National Center of Missing.
I also want to put a plug in for Safe Path because they are Safe Path Children's Advocacy Center. They are a great resource. They work hand in hand with our detectives, with DFACS, with other agencies, not just with Cobb County Police, with other agencies in Cobb County. They are wonderful. They not only help us throughout the investigative phase, but after we're done with our case, they continue to work with the children and their families as far as recovery goes.
And that website for National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is missingkids.org. That's missingkids with an S.org.
And I want to thank everyone for listening to Let's Talk with Christeria Lynn on Power 108.9. We are back next week at 9 o'clock. And I want to thank Officer Melton and Sergeant Delp and Cordell for their time today. See you later. You didn't want too many questions, Sergeant Delp.
Actually, it was right on time. Stay covered. No, that was good. It flowed.
I know, it sounds like...
Yeah.